Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're going to be talking about a case that I've never mentioned before on this channel. I had really been meaning to do an upload on the case of Amber Tuccaro. This, of course, comes to us from Canada. We're going back to 2010, and this is actually going to be one of the more recent cases that we've covered on this channel. Of course, we've done some stuff about the Zodiac Killer, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders from 1946, and even Leopold and Loeb we mentioned recently. But this is one of the more recent cases, like in terms of timeline. Like, we're going only back to 2010. Amber Tuccaro was last seen trying to head toward the city of Edmonton in Alberta, Canada. And if you're listening to this, I'm sure you probably have some familiarity with the famous voicemail, the famous recording of Amber Tuccaro talking to an unknown male in a car who claims to be driving her to 50th Street in Edmonton, Alberta. But Amber obviously has some sense of awareness. She's noticing that he's driving her kind of into rural countryside areas, and I believe there's even one line in the voice recording that I was just listening to where she says that the road's turning into gravel, obviously heading into a very rural area. And this is not just a missing persons case, of course. I mean, in 2012, the remains of Amber Tuccaro were found, and I was on the Huffington Post Canada website, and they actually stated very specifically that people stumbled upon the remains of Amber Tuccaro in all of the numerous tips that they had, and the numerous people who were just listening to the recording and come and making tips and comments. They got flooded on the hotline. They were not actually very helpful. It was just two people stumbled upon the remains of Amber Tuccaro. It was kind of an unfortunate thing to think about. But what really happened, Amber Tuccaro was a young mother. She was 20 years old, and she was the youngest of 5 siblings, the only girl in the family. And, she leaves behind her son. Her mother seems very distraught about it when you watch the interviews with her mother. Of course, distraught as in, yes, we use that word because somebody lost their child, but one of the issues that we really note with this case is kind of just how the way the authorities handled it. The family seems very disappointed with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, because they basically claimed for 2 years that the investigation didn't really go anywhere. They didn't really get any sort of kind of action from the RCMP. And eventually they put up the billboards and they put out the recording, and after almost 2 years, but shortly after that happened in 2012, we mentioned that Amber's body was discovered, and we have the recording of an unknown man talking about driving her somewhere. One of the biggest things, though, that I didn't quite comprehend about this case is kind of the motivation for Amber to get into this individual's car. Now, I was just she's on a trip, right? But then she's just going from the motel that she was staying to Edmonton, just in some guy's car, and I was like, wait a second, what on earth is going on there? What's the motivation for that? Now, if you're somewhat familiar with true crime, you've probably heard of the Highway of Tears. This is kind of the sort of, I believe it's actually a series of highways in Western Canada. We're going to be going through things like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and parts of British Columbia. The Highway of Tears, and there are just numerous murders that happen along these highways. And I was on the Wikipedia for this, and that's actually just kind of chilling to just kind of read it off the way they present it, about the motivations, about why there's so many murders in Western Canada, particularly of Indigenous women, which Amber was. I believe her ancestry was Cree. But it's the motivation for that is they're first we need to say Western Canada is very sparsely populated. Manitoba, I was once told, had a population of 1.9 people per square kilometer. Very, very sparsely populated. So one of the things that people do is hitchhiking. It is very normal to hitchhike from town to town across the vastness of Canada. the vastness of these, western flatlands in Canada, or even through some of the more mountainous terrain, but especially through the flatlands, and there's a reason for that. But in all reality, this might not have seemed that abnormal to somebody like Amber to try and hitch a ride into Edmonton from some unknown driver. What they're sort of trying to say is, and once again, I mean, this is the stuff that we talk about with the Highway of Tears. This is like, I mean, the Wikipedia put it out in a very nutshell version, but this is a much more elaborate kind of setup. It's just that it's probably not that abnormal for someone like her, in her own mindset at the time, to accept a ride or to take a ride or to even want to get into some guy's car driving to Edmonton. It seems like lots of people get around Western Canada using this method. Sadly, that leads to these horrendous tragedies, such as all of the murders that have happened along these highways in Western Canada. And one of the other motivations, we mentioned the flatlands, is that the soil is somewhat rather soft, and people think that it's actually a very suitable place for disposing bodies. And I'm reading over this stuff, and I was just like, ugh, this is just morbid. I mean, we cover a lot of heinous murders on this true crime channel, but I was just like, I mean, you don't really get used to it. You don't really get that desensitized. And you're just, I mean, the soil is soft, so it's a good place to bury a body. So then you go picking up hitchhikers and you murder them. Disgusting. This is horrible behavior. But it's actually something similar to that happened to Amber Tuccaro. Now, the reason why we mentioned the voicemail is, I mean, you can't really hear a news clip of the case without hearing the recording of Amber Tuccaro. What happened was her brother was incarcerated, and originally, when I first found out about this case, I thought that she had called him, like she had made a call to just a family member, and like she has her cell phone kind of concealed, and the cell phone call was immediately recorded because her brother was incarcerated. He was in prison, and the prison automatically recorded the calls. But I believe actually her brother just happened to try to call her. I believe they said it was an outgoing call from the prison, and it was the outgoing calls that were immediately recorded. So that's why we have this very clear recording of the perpetrator's voice, the alleged perpetrator, we should say. I mean, is it possible that Amber Tuccaro got out of the car at some point and then someone else did something to her? Yes, but that's very unlikely. But yeah, I mean, her brother was in prison and all outgoing calls were immediately recorded. That's why we have this very clear recording of his, of the alleged perpetrator's voice. Okay, so, who is he? This is a tough one. I mentioned how, like Huffington Post Canada was saying that the tips that were coming in were not that helpful, and the tips that were coming in did not assist in identifying the body. And I was just like, when you're examining this particular case, all you really have is a man who has somewhat of a Canadian accent. I mean, it sounds Canadian enough to me, talking about driving toward 50th Street, north of Beaumont, using the back roads to get into the city. No specific information revealed. She's not saying, addressing him by name, although, if I understand, I mean, like, this part I'm a little hazy on, was it that Amber wasn't completely aware that this phone call had been received, and that she couldn't really say, oh, I'm with John Smith, or whatever his name would be. I mean, this is just something that, was picked up and that was kind of unintentionally recorded. So, Amber isn't really giving away anything about the color of the car, the make and model. I mean, we don't really have a whole lot of detail in this call. And it's going to be very, very difficult unless, like, someone recognizes a family member, a former coworker. But still, identifying them only by voice, that'd be pretty difficult. You imagine just listening to a voice recording of someone that could be one of your former coworkers, unless they had a very distinct speech pattern. I mean, that might be rather difficult. Well, then what do we do? A couple theories have emerged. One theory online was actually suggesting that this person is not a typical murderer associated with the Highway of Tears. The Highway of Tears, yes. This person is not, this person was kind of new to the area, and that this was actually the work of the West Mesa killer down in Arizona. And people are matching up voice recordings, and it sort of sounded like there are a little bit of similarities there, but based on the enormous amount of activity that we have going on with the Highway of Tears, it's like, I think that this is kind of just a prime ground that people are using to lure unsuspecting individuals such as Amber Tuccaro, as horrendous as that sounds. I mean, is this guy some type of serial murderer? I don't know if he's a serial killer, if this was just his first time and a situation got out of hand. We mentioned some of these things when we were discussing the case of Maura Murray, about how, well, do you think that, like, someone who abducts somebody, are they necessarily an opportunistic serial killer? I mean, we also mentioned this during the case of Marcia King, where it could be like, did this guy just pick her up and then demand sex, and then the situation got all out of hand? Is it just something like that? Is it just a situation that lost control? Well, based on the location of where they're driving to, how they're kind of driving in some sort of roundabout way, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, this is probably a very calculated attempt. I mean, once this guy had her in his car, once this guy had her in his car, he probably knew that he was going to assault her and most likely murder her. I mean, when you say it like that, it's very morbid stuff, but I mean, if she were found closer to 50th Street in Edmonton, maybe we could say that this was a situation that got out of control, but being that her body was found in such a rural area, and they weren't exactly going where he said they were going, so this is probably some very, very opportunistic murderer, and that's just disgusting, to be honest. There's no way to bring any kind of silver lining to that particular issue. Okay, so we talked about the West Mesa killer theory. One person was actually commenting on that one, and I began to sort of look into that a little bit more, where the comment was that the police have a suspect. Even that person's going as far as to say that the police know who the guy in the recording is. That he's a man who works in or around Leduc, Canada, but he has not been apprehended because they are trying to build up their evidence. Like, they don't want to arrest him without the proper evidence and such. And, like, when I read that, I was like, holy crap. I mean, like, that's some those are very specific things that you're revealing. I mean, and, like, I was looking through some of the other comments, and it was like, no one really seemed to ask, like, hey, where did you get that from? But, I mean, there it is, though. And there was, like, another YouTube video that was done on this case. It was done in Spanish, though. And I'll hopefully post a link to that for anyone who speaks Spanish. And I believe that there was one line in there. My Spanish is not very good, but I think they also said one sentence in there about the police did have a suspect and they did know someone who could potentially be involved with this. Very good presentation on it, mind you. Once again, I'll post a link to that in the description for the Spanish speakers, but it's like, it was a very good presentation on the case. The real things we need to look at with the disappearance of Amber Tuccaro is that, as we mentioned, the biggest one, it's not that big of a deal that she would be kind of trying to hitch a ride or just get a ride from a stranger moving across Canada. It seems like that's rather normal behavior, and it also seems like that it just goes to show you that while we hope that things like billboards and hotlines and giving tips to the police, giving tips to the RCMP, we hope that these things are very helpful and productive. They aren't always that helpful and productive. I mean, we talked about the case of Jason Derek Brown on this channel, who's on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. They just get thousands upon thousands of tips all the time about that particular case, and he still has not been apprehended. So, I mean, there's something that we really need to recognize about that, about the people are going to the authorities when they do not have the proper information. And it can be clouding investigations. It can be bogging down investigations. And I believe they even talked about this in the Texarkana Moonlight Murders all the way back in 1946, when they were just like putting out a notice. They're like, please don't spread rumors and gossip about saying, oh, so and so told me, or I think this. And like, when you're dealing with something that is kind of like a true crime case, if the police do indeed have a suspect, then what are they waiting for? It's been 9 years since Amber was taken. It's been 7 years since Amber was found. I mean, what really would they be what exactly would they be waiting for? So I'm very skeptical about that theory. When it comes to the theories of what actually happened, we've kind of broken it down pretty clearly. Amber was trying to get a ride to Edmonton. She says that very clearly. She wants to go into the city. And this guy says he'll take her to Edmonton, but then he starts driving in a different direction. Someone was preying on a vulnerable individual. Someone was preying on a vulnerable 20-year-old woman. This guy knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't some sort of incident that got out of control. And hopefully someday someone will be brought to justice. And if the police do have someone, I would really hope that they are able to make an arrest soon. And I just wish that there was kind of an easier way to go about this particular one. What I can say about the case of Amber Tuccaro, to kind of bring something positive to the situation, is I first found out about this one from countdown sites. Usually it's stuff like maybe top 5 crimes with a disturbing phone recording, something like that, except they have more glamorous clickbait titles. What I can really say is that the internet really has raised exposure of this, and just the countdown websites talk about Amber Tuccaro quite frequently. Disturbing phone messages, disturbing voicemails, all of those things. Henry McCabe usually comes up on those as well. But it's like, what we can recognize is that Amber Tuccaro is, something where it's receiving a lot of exposure. Maybe someone will recognize the voice and recognize it as a family member, as we said, a former co-worker, something like that. And we hope that someone can be brought to justice, because it's just the entire Highway of Tears incident is an absolute tragedy. That so many murders are taking place in that particular part of the country. And that they're happening, period. I mean, that shouldn't even really be a thing, but people are preying on vulnerable individuals. And, I mean, it's one of the things is that it's not only that the highways are dealing with areas that are very remote and such, it's that, I mean, there isn't always necessarily a bus line that is going to be coming that day. That there isn't going to be a taxi service that is going to move you from the motel where Amber was to Edmonton. It's difficult to move around in these parts of the... And also, sometimes with people on the Highway of Tears, they just don't even have the money to buy the bus ticket or the whatever sort of transportation fare that they are looking for. Sometimes it's an economic issue. Sometimes it's a location issue. And sometimes it's just a familiarity issue. I mean, if they're saying that people normally get rides from strangers and they normally do things like hitchhiking to go from city to city or town to town, they've probably done it a few times successfully, and then this happens to be the time that it leads to a catastrophe. It is just a very devastating thing, but let's hope that we are able to one day solve the case of who murdered Amber Tuccaro. I do think that this is a case that can be solved, and it's not one of the more kind of far-out mysteries that is so extreme that we might never get a conclusion. I hope that one day someone is brought to justice.